Welcome back to the Impact Driven Leader podcast. This is your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. So glad you're here listening in. If you're watching on YouTube, glad to see you as well. I'll smile. I hope you smile too. Man, I'm excited for this conversation that you get to tune into, listen to with Marlene Chism. Marlene is a consultant speaker. She's done a ton of trainings on LinkedIn Learning. She wrote the book From Conflict to Courage, which we're going to reference in this podcast. The reason that I'm excited for you to hear this conversation with Marlene is one, just based on this idea of conflict. You know, we live in a society that is overwhelmed with conflict. You know, there's certain personalities that really try to avoid conflict. Well, Marlene makes the case that when we become comfortable with conflict, that it's really everything good comes from it. It's have the courage, in my own words, to endure conflict, to know that conflict, however it's defined, really kind of leads to some of the greatest developments that we can have. Because without conflict, everyone's just kind of going along, go along. Whether you're a leader in an office, you're a leader just in your family, there's conflict. And the more that it's avoided, usually it gets ugly. That's what I found. That's what Marlene found. And she'll, share with us many tips that she has to manage through conflict, to become comfortable with conflict, to understand conflict is just a tool that can be used. I hope you get value out of this episode today. Thanks again for listening in. As always, if you get, value out of this, subscribe, share it with someone. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube as well. Glad you're here. Get ready to take some notes and enjoy this conversation with Ms. Marlene Chism. Well, good afternoon, Marlene. I'm so excited to chat with you. I'm so excited to let more people know about your book, the most recent book, From Conflict to Courage. When I first saw that word conflict, I got quite intrigued. And of course, as courage is something that I think as a leader, the more that we can embrace courage, the better leaders we can be. So I'm excited to dig into that and talk about it. But, for maybe many of my audience who haven't maybe gone through some of your courses on LinkedIn or don't know who you are, I'd love for you to just take a second and just tell the audience who Marlene is.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation we're going to have. I'm a consultant, an author, a trainer. I do it all, and all of it's really under consulting the way I see it, because I always want my work to be strategic. But it really started out with stop workplace drama, then no drama leadership. So you can kind of see that theme running through of drama. And, they say you teach what you need to learn, right? So drama, and this one is From Conflict to Courage, how to stop avoiding and start leading, and started that during the pandemic. So I'm excited that it's almost here.
Yeah. So a question, you talked about conflict, you talked about drama. You said, in your book too, you're like, hey, and I believe this, leaders teach what they know. And sometimes they learn the hard way. I've learned a lot of things the hard way. I'd love for you to kind of take the audience through, how did this kind of like this concept, the whole drama and conflict that you saw in leadership show up in your life and to where you wanted to learn more and help people solve that problem?
Well, that's such a big question. It actually started when I got introduced to something called the Karpman Drama Triangle, and it really changed my life. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
It's a tool. It's a transactional analysis tool developed by Dr. Stephen Karpman. So backwards a little bit, when I was going to get my master's degree and sort of still searching, I was in my business already, but struggling like most new businesses do. I thought, well, I might as well go get a master's degree. And my professor said, if you'll just stick this out and get a master's degree, you will build a capstone. And that capstone can lay a foundation to where you can be like Stephen Covey. And I had no idea what he was talking about, but I had been first introduced to the drama triangle, was very interested in human dynamics and in family systems and then how that could apply to the workplace. So I used that idea of drama in the workplace, how it affects productivity and relationships. So I built a capstone around drama and how it affects well-being, health, relationships. And that just sort of became, as you research, as you know, you start getting more and more, and it's just one thread after another. Yeah. And then my first book was Stop Workplace Drama.
So I believe this, and I've been taught this as people that have helped me. Each of us are unique, and we have a unique superpower, and we have a unique problem that we can solve. For me, it was, overcoming and dealing with understanding a lot of insecurity. And I believe the solution to insecurity is empathy. And I define empathy for you and maybe a new listener is putting your arms around someone and walking with them. And to me, that's what the action of empathy in a leadership position is. So I want to take that mindset. So give you a little context there. How did Marlene really get intrigued by drama and say, I want to make that my capstone? Was it a life experience? Was it a work experience?
It was both.
Okay.
I was one of those people that was searching for something new, and I'd been at a job for 21 years. And so the way that I position this is that I went through what I call the 3 life tragedies. The first one is, you want something more, but you don't know what it is. And I was there for a very long time. Then the next one is, you know what it is, but you don't believe it's possible. Then you know what it is, you believe it's possible, but you have to be willing. So this for me started that search. And I now, looking back on it, see the value of wondering about purpose, sort of getting started in blue collar work, not having any kind of framework and knowledge about how to make something happen. And so I see a lot of people now that they get stuck on the what's my purpose, and then they get stuck there. So I always say, well, your purpose, I'm going to give you one. It's to discover, develop, and deliver your gifts to the world. So if you just know that, it's okay to be in discovery mode. Even if you're 35 or 40, it's okay that you're in discovery mode. That might mean going to get a master's degree. That might mean going to college, taking your first class. It might mean volunteering or trying a new business on the side. So it doesn't matter as long as you understand I'm in discovery mode. There's no need to prove myself to try to be successful. I'm in discovery. So once I kind of got that, I saw how that journey that was the inner journey for me, a personal journey. I started getting interested in leadership and management because that's what the opportunity was in the marketplace. And so then I started thinking about how the drama triangle applied to leadership and how I could make that into a business concept. So that's kind of how it started. It started with my own desire of wanting to do and be more, but not knowing how to do that. And then taking that and really developing myself into that expert and knowing how that happens now.
Yeah. So, love to unpack that a little bit because I think, one, I'm excited about it. It's, you working in blue colors, you said, is you describe in your book, but also, bios, factory work, done everything there. And then you have this kind of, I would say, coming of age, which I've gone through. And I think it's kind of like, what do I really want to do? How do I really want to serve people? I think we're seeing a lot of that in the last couple of years. COVID has driven people into that. They've also probably driven much what I would align with you is like, I'm working at a place that's not bringing out the best in me. And they're like, I want to go find something different. And that's what I kind of hear from you, develop, kind of understanding how much of what you saw and had to work with from a leadership perspective really drove you to say, man, I want to be a part of the change and know that upcoming leaders, I can help them be better leaders.
I started thinking about it from this perspective of, I saw this vision that I wanted to be maybe a speaker. I wanted to be a professional speaker and a trainer perhaps, but no bigger than that at the first. And at first we all want to change someone else and we say, that's poor leadership. And I did that for sure. I'd say, I had a boss that had 3 sayings. That's not the way it is. I didn't ask you to work here. If you don't like it, find yourself another place to work. So I had that awareness, but what really got me was more transformational. It was the understanding that even though I was at the lowest rung and I worked in a factory and had no real power, if I couldn't practice the concepts I wanted to teach right from where I was, it would never have the power, because it's always easy to look outside of yourself and say they need to be different. And when I leave this factory, I'm going to tell bosses what not to do. I looked at it from a standpoint of, if I've got to have a difficult conversation with this difficult boss, it's not about me keeping notes on how he should change. It's about how can I, as someone powerless, actually facilitate change. So that was really my method.
Man, I love that, because it's so valuable for whatever relationship. This whole idea of conflict, here's what I believe. I look at it as, you can describe it as conflict or difficult conversations, right? We could parse that apart. But one of the things that I've learned, and I don't think everyone has this opinion because they haven't gone through it, is when I know there's going to be hard conversations, I get excited because I know this. I know something good is going to come from it. And I don't believe everyone has that mindset about conflict. And you kind of dive into that a little bit in your book, but I'd love to have you share more of why doesn't everyone have that opinion of conflict, or why do some people, kind of this whole idea of like, how can I avoid conflict as opposed to seeing it as a catalyst to what you just described as like, hey, I actually have some influence here.
Yes. I think that first of all, because the definitions that we see for conflict, I looked it up in the dictionary when I started doing this book, and it's like a war, a clash. It's like it's win-lose kind of thing. And I also think on the other spectrum is this positive psychology of embrace it. I think there's a middle ground where we say, okay, the reason something's hard, and it doesn't matter if what's hard for me is not hard for you. If it's hard for me, it's hard. If it's hard for you, it's hard. And so where we get off track is, oh, that's nothing. All you got to do. And it's really not about all you got to do and the only skill you need. Skills are helpful. But what's really helpful is to redefine it to say it's an opposing drive, desire, and demand. So in other words, it's one arrow is going this way, another one's going this way. So instead of saying, well, they are so stingy, that business unit manager isn't concerned about my budget, and they are so selfish, they don't see the bigger picture. If I can get out of the labeling and all that, say, it must be that I don't understand their drives, desires, and demands. And while it might be stingy, and there might be evidence of that, if I can understand their drive, desire, and demand, we might be closer than we think to having a real conversation and getting agreement. So it's this ability to feel safe and to not feel threatened, like I have to win or I have to have the right comeback, that I can actually feel something. And even if you smart off to me, I have the ability to say, I can circle back on that. I don't have to respond right now. I don't have to have the best, latest, tagline to win this argument. I can truly come from curiosity. Now, I will say I'm not there 100% of the time because I am a witty, sarcastic person that's fast. I think fast. But the more I try and the more I rewire myself, I have now decided to interpret my anger as I must need more information.
What's funny about that is I find myself depending on the relationship where it's a lot easier. My wife, it's hard. Other people, it's a little bit easier. And I think that's what's interesting to me as I read the book. And be honest, like at the first, this is like anxious and intense, because if I see someone in my life that, wants to avoid conflict most, it's my wife. And she does it from an honest point of view. She doesn't want people to be upset. She wants people to feel good. She was also raised in a home that the worst thing you could have was conflict. Conflict was avoided at every single point. The home I was raised in, it was like, well, conflict is okay. Disagreements are good. Like having different opinions, while, that was fostered and that was encouraged, and it created sparks at times, sure, but I never went out of that, and especially as an Enneagram 8 who's a challenger, I didn't see conflict as bad. Whereas, and again, she was raised in a home that is like the worst thing that could happen was conflict. And that means that someone just didn't submit and someone had to submit. And it's like, I don't get that. Like conflict's good.
When it makes you feel unsafe, that's the real problem. And
Yeah.
I think what you said, you can fight. And I think sometimes we can argue and even, it's not even real effective, but as long as we trust the relationship, as long as there's that trust, it doesn't excuse really bad behavior like name calling or violent kind of behavior, but it's easier to not be so polished if someone knows your heart and you're trustworthy. So I really think the foundation of it is respect and a good relationship. And even if you get a little off base, there's some forgiveness. And like you said, we're a little bit different at home in some ways than we are at work because we're more comfortable, or maybe we're not as comfortable because it might be divorce. So it just depends on context to some degree. We just have to reevaluate how we see it.
The context there that I try to relate this back to is this idea in your title of like having courage to, even though if we don't understand the conflict, to what you said earlier, is be curious to it. Mm-hmm. I think as a leader, I think of someone that's trying to influence others, the more curiosity we can have helps diffuse some of that conflict. Because if someone has a opinion, or, in this situation where they say there's an issue here, being curious to say, okay, why is it that they have that perspective? And if I lean into that as opposed to whatever they're trying to do is to hurt me, man, I feel like then all of a sudden that conflict turns into I'm courageously want to engage.
Yeah,
That's my viewpoint. I'd love for you to.
Yeah, I'm curious. That is right. I try to increase my curiosity. It's hard to, though, when you want to win something, when you think you're right, whenever they don't understand, when you feel like you're not understood, it's really hard to be curious. This is one of the philosophies of the book that I think is going to help a lot of people. And it's something that some people have a hard time grasping at first, but there's a philosophy in the book that there is no conflict unless there's first an inner conflict. So what I mean by that is, if let's say I need to talk with you and it's going to be difficult, but I like you and I don't want you to be mad at me, and I've seen you be defensive before, and he can be rough because he doesn't mind conflict. So now I have an inner conflict. I want to say something, but I also want you to like me. So now that's what the real conflict is there, because we haven't even had the conversation yet. And yet I'm telling my friends, I already know what he's going to say. I've had this before, and he's going to say X, Y, and Z, and then I'm going to say A, B, C, and then we're going to play verbal ping pong. So what my method is really a lot is to identify the inner conflict. Where am I divided? And why am I divided? If I'm divided that I have to have a difficult performance conversation, is it because I see them as weak? Is it because I've allowed the behavior for 2 years and now I'm a part of that and I know they're going to say that's not fair? Why didn't you make Jane do the same thing? So we have to resolve the inner conflict really before we engage. If it's really a conflict and we're avoiding, we have to resolve what's going on internally first.
So in the people that you've helped, the leaders, how much do you think that is the bigger conflict?
I know that's the bigger conflict, is either a lack of self-awareness of where they've contributed to the problem, or they've exaggerated and they don't know how to get to the facts, or what I find is the bigger problem, and I call it leadership clarity in my book. This is, and I'm probably sure you have this, you see this problem with your clients that first engage with you. They have their idea about what solution they need before they've even defined the real problem. And so I call that leadership clarity. We want to really articulate and understand the situation first. Then we want to say, what's the outcome we're seeking? And then we have the 2 points that create dynamic tension. Then we want to say, well, what are the real or perceived obstacles? Because until you understand that, and it takes time, but everybody wants a workshop, a coaching initiative, a project, and they've already figured it out. And I get the third person down to call me and say, what's your price? So that's my biggest problem that I have in educating, either deciding to do a training workshop to get my foot in the door, or to say, let's really evaluate what's the situation, what's the outcome, and what's the obstacle, because many times the real situation is the top leader doesn't know how to communicate downward and coach that leader, right?
Well, it's when leaders, or, again, this struggle of inner conflict then creates abdication to say, hey, just solve the problem for me. It's like, no, you're the problem. It's like, but the problem is that you're choosing not to engage because you're stuck in this inner conflict of, well, I don't have to deal with that problem. That's not my problem to deal with. I think that's, to my viewpoint, if we look at the leadership arena in the world today, that's a lot of it, is we have a changing of generation. We have a younger generation of leader that's now thrust into the position of leading, and they're looking at to say, well, what model do I follow? And, or is all conflict bad? Because as a generation, we've had this, hey, we'll just avoid conflict, as opposed to, you know what, courageously, I'm going to find reality and try to identify reality. And you discuss a little bit of that. So I'd like to take some time, is like, what's the process that you've seen to help leadership define reality, to kind of process through that conflict?
I'll say a question that I'll ask is, it's so simple. It is, what is happening that should not be happening? Or what is not happening that should be? Because if you can actually say what is happening or not happening that should or should not be happening, you're really close. If you're just speaking in facts and not your perception. Because if you're saying something like, oh, well, they've got a terrible attitude and they're not engaged, I don't know what that means. What's the evidence of that? Okay, they should be giving ideas at meetings and they're not giving ideas at meetings. I can work with that. Then we can dig a little deeper to say, well, if you would shut up and ask a question, maybe they would, right? Like you think they need a workshop to engage. Actually, you need to be quiet and listen. So it's just about really identifying, if they can articulate that, I can work with them. And a lot of times I solve it before we ever even engage in a project, because it's really pretty simple. It's almost always a lack of awareness, lack of clarity, and a lack of leadership clarity. And once you can get to that root of what's happening or not happening versus all the story you have around it, including the story of, I'm a hands-off leader, this was their job. No, you're their boss. So you also have to coach and mentor them. So
Yeah.
it's the stories we tell ourselves. It's the assumptions that we make. It's the lack of clarity.
So, I mean, you identify in this conversation we've talked about is like really the hardest person for any leader to lead is themselves. And it's finding that clarity. It's identifying, the inner conflict. Where do you think is the greatest place to start for a leader in that, like, okay, where's my self-leadership start or structuring that to start?
Well, I would say self-awareness, first of all, know yourself. And, you can take the disc and the different measurement tools. Those are helpful. Be careful not to let that become your identity is what I want to say, because you can change, you can make shifts. So I like to talk about what am I committed to? Like, what are my values? To me, that's a place to start. And we talk about that and it sounds so esoteric. But what I mean by this, you have to embody it, because you can say, oh, I value respect. I value kindness. And then yet you're on social media calling people names if they don't believe it the same way you do politically. So you might value it. You're misaligned though, because you're not living it. Because if you value kindness, you'll be kind even when it's difficult to be kind. If you value respect, you'll respect people even though you'd rather call them a name or win the argument. So embodying values is about really clarifying, what does that value mean? How does it show up? How do I identify it? How do I see the lack of it? So a lot of my work is about listening to what people say they value and looking about how they behave. There was once I was working with a group of hospital executives, and I asked what their top value was. And of course, this was a corporate value, which was obviously compassion, because it always is in healthcare. And when I said, well, what does compassion look like? Stunned, silent. I mean, deer in the headlight. Don't know. Yeah. Well, but the guy stocks the toilet paper so that it's easier for people to grab what they need. That's compassion. And I said, or is that a watered down, just so that we can say that fits into, like, to me, that's just doing your job. That's consideration. But compassion to me is the nurse who has already worked a double shift, but someone's husband got sick and they're willing to stay 2 more hours until someone else comes in. Or it's sitting with a patient when they're already tired. Compassion to me is so much different than just stocking toilet paper because you're getting paid to do it. So I think it's about really setting and visiting with what that looks like in your workplace. How do you know it? How do you define it? How do you smell it? What does it look like, sound like, taste like? Because if you can't do that, it's not a real value.
Yeah. I shared this, I think, in one of my recent conversations, and it's something new that I've discovered. And, I believe this, that if the values of an organization and a leader aren't identified in the mission and the vision, then it's really not a core value. Because I believe that, as you just shared, that if a hospital says compassion, but their mission is not to, display compassion, or if in their vision they're saying, hey, we treat our customers, we treat our patients with compassion, and this is what it looks like, then I think it's really hard for people to say, oh, that makes sense. I think you take that one step deeper. What does every leader have? And what does that look like? And as you just said in that exercise, okay, you say compassion, but how does that really play out? Yeah. And I think that's where you see one leader move in and one leader move out, and they're kind of like, oh, we had compassion on the wall, but we never really did anything with it. So it must not be that important, as opposed to taking the opportunity. It's like, what really does matter to the job we do?
And really the conversations that we have. So if I'm coaching an employee to say, so that showed me a lack of compassion when you left early. It showed a lack of concern, which is very well related to compassion, because how do you think someone felt when they were needing to go home? So using it in your conversation, in your language, in the way that you make decisions versus, well, it's up there, but like, this is really just about you doing what the policy says.
Yeah.
So it's embodiment. I've had so many leaders say, and they throw all these models, sometimes CEOs of companies like maybe small businesses, small enterprises, they're excited about leadership because they're studying it, and they've read every book on leadership, and they're showing this one's model on this and this one's model on that. And they want their employees to memorize these models, and they don't know why they're not getting it. Well, for one thing, it's not about a checklist or memorizing models. The model is there to help you incorporate something and to make it easy, a mental map for you to understand how to use this material and apply it to your own life. So when you're throwing so much training and development and models at people, the behavior is what really counts. And that's a slower process. So I think
Yeah.
that's part of the issue too.
Well, I think it's, we have come fast into our world where everyone, you mentioned this earlier, we break down the corporate hierarchy, right? The CEO says we need to have better, leaders. We don't have enough good leaders. Then you go to, one of the HR, the VP, and they're like, all right, well, how do we put together this leadership training? It's like, well, XYZ person has the perfect formula. This will just fit. And the hard time I have with that is, I mentioned I grew up on a farm. Right. And, I learned a lot through life growing up on a farm. And, one day, this is the situation was in front of me. I had the only tools that I had. And the next day, the situation is totally different. I got the same tools. I need to know how to use those tools. And I think that's what I seek it so often lost. And I try to talk about here on this podcast is like, it isn't necessarily having the perfect, recipe of what to do. It's knowing, hey, here are the tools in your toolbox. Figure out how to use them. And I think, as I hear from you, part of that is understanding that conflict can be used as a tool, not something to avoid.
Yeah, it's something that you can use to expand yourself. That's how I look at it.
Okay.
We're always, kind of pointing at other people and what they have to do. It may be true they need to do that. But if you look at conflict as my greatest teacher, why do I feel so resistant about this? Why am I avoiding this conversation? Why did I say, yeah, that's a great idea when in fact I thought it wasn't? And was there a better way to say, I'm not sure. I want to, like, there's still ways to be really kind. Even if you have conflict, to say, I want to marinate on that because I'm having some inner conflict versus, oh, I love it. You're so smart. If we're not aware of the ways we appease other people and try to get and manipulate to get our way, if we're not aware, then we're going to have a lot of conflict without meaning to create that conflict. And I often say we're only as honest as our own levels of self-awareness. I was working with one client where they're wondering why some of the people they serve are so angry, and it comes to find out they're promising things they can't deliver. Because they're wink, wink, yeah, this is great. This is going to be an awesome opportunity, good sales, but you can't follow through. So we have to be really aware of where we mislead people by false expectations.
You identify it, and I think it makes so much sense because we seek comfort first, right? And that's how you identify it. And I think that sinks in and makes so much sense. So like, if our first inclination is always comfort, we're not going to necessarily grow, and we're not going to experience some of the painful stuff that actually is going to help move everything forward. We're going to, like you said.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, we're going to say, oh yeah, that's great. Let's do that because it's comfortable, as opposed to, no, that stretches me. I'm not real comfortable with that. It's not an ethical problem. It doesn't conflict my values, but that's hard. As opposed to being that transparent and honest, we're just like, okay, great, I'll go along with it.
Yeah, part of the work in this book, I talk about emotional integrity and being willing to really represent yourself and to say, it's okay to say, I'm angry when I hear that, or I'm confused and I want time to think about it. Like just the other day, I had a pretty big opportunity, and while I was having the opportunity and excited, I also felt overwhelmed. So I just said, I'm just going to be transparent. It sounds fun and I can see how wonderful it would be, but I also feel really overwhelmed. And so I've got to align this excitement with the belief that I can deliver for you. Oh no, you wouldn't have to do this part. I'm like, see, if I would have not brought that up, I would have either turned it down or not continued the conversation because I'm not going to be overwhelmed. It's not worth it to me right now. But if I just say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I want you to think I'm competent, but there's many factors going on in my life right now. So let's talk about that and what you really expect.
And to me, that's authenticity.
Yeah.
And the more that we courageously embrace that internal conflict, man, I think that's what healthy leadership looks like.
Yes.
It's not, I had a friend, and I'll share this for your fact. He said, the CEO that makes the biggest impact isn't the guy or girl that's sitting there that has their hair in perfect spot. They got the perfect suit. Everything looks perfect. It's the one that stands in front of the room, has their sleeves rolled up and says, my pits are sweating too, but I believe in everyone in the room and we can get this done. Like, that's the person that I want to follow. It's not the one that's like, no, this is a problem. We got this. It's okay. Because that false bravado gets back to that. Are they just trying to make everyone comfortable, or are they willing to be authentic and say, hey, here's what's really in front of us?
Yeah, that's probably the scariest part of leadership, is just really, it's that inner work. Because if you're really, really smart and educated and you rose fast, it's hard to want to be humble. It's hard to want to look inward. There's a desire that has to come with that. You have to see the greater good. It can't just be about, the numbers and my success and what everybody else thinks. So I think that's where conflict comes in. You can say that you don't have problems with conflict, but if you're at the top, you don't have to have problems with it. The more power you have, and I think Daniel Goleman said, the less aware you are.
Yeah. I mean, Kat Cole, who, with Yum Brands and now with, I think, Athletic Greens, she says, get closer to the transaction. As a humility for a leader, is the closer you get to the transaction, the less, kind of rose-colored glasses that you can have on, because that's the real problem. Like, they don't care about our packaging. They care about the product and, making sure that's good. Or they don't care what the product looks like. They want to make sure the packaging makes them feel good to buy that product, consume that product. And I think those are, again, you wrestle with these conflicts. And I love the word courage, because to me, it just takes courage to manage through all that. And if you can have courage to manage through it, you're going to be all right.
You expand. And then, the way that that you've changed is that what bothered you last year or last week or last month now becomes something where you're curious, or something where you stay in the conversation, or where you circle back around. I see so many leaders say, well, I missed my opportunity and I should have said, I would have said, and I'll do it next time. And my suggestion is circle back around and say, I got to thinking about our conversation, because it's easy to tell yourself a lie that you'll get it next time, but you have to learn how to rewire. And the only way you rewire is to trigger some sort of emotion. And you're going to have emotion if you promise yourself you're going to circle back around and address something that was difficult to you. And now you're telling yourself it's no longer difficult. I got it. Next time I'll do this. You may not, unless you circle back around.
Yeah. I mean, it's being willing to say, I need to take a different look at this. I need to see it from a different perspective. And that means, I didn't get it right the first time. And maybe I have to come to grips with, as you said earlier, that inner conflict of, or are they going to think less of me because I have to take a different look at this? I need to reevaluate my stance, my tactics, my strategy, and having the security to do so.
And knowing that people appreciate when you help own the problem. So one of the concepts I talk about is just own your part. Like, hey, I've noticed, I've observed X, Y, and Z. Here's the deal. I've allowed this for 3 years. I did it because of COVID. I should have stopped it 4 months into COVID. Overwhelmed, no excuse, but we're going to have a fresh slate, a clean slate. That way, I'm a part of it. It's not just you. You should have known. You did bad. No, I, as a leader, I avoided something because of many factors. Now we're going to have a clean slate, and now we can get realigned. And people appreciate that so much when they don't feel like they're getting blamed.
I have a 15-year-old daughter. And a week or so ago, and it's funny, kids today, they, of course, text, and that's how they start conversations. And she's telling me about some of her grades and how, she's like, my grades aren't where they're supposed to be. And she's explaining it to me. And she's like, I know you're going to be mad at me. I'm like, I'm actually not mad at you, but I'm thinking back, that was her conflict that she thought sharing that was going to make me upset. And I'm like, no, you've owned it. we're good. If you had said there's nothing wrong, all of a sudden we get your grades and you've blown it off, then we're going to have an issue. But it also made me stop and think, it's like, okay, her perception was that I was going to be angry. And it's kind of like, well, that's a healthy fear in a way, but yet how am I reacting at times to drive that? And I think that could be the same in any leadership relationship. If people are coming to you and they're willing to say it because they have to, but they're concerned about you being upset, own that and say, hey, and I explained to her, I would be upset if you didn't own it, but you owned it. We are good to go. There's nothing too big to deal with.
Yeah, I love how you're promoting that with your children, just the ownership idea of that. I saw something, I think it was Jordan Peterson. It was on a video that said a snowball is better than an avalanche. So when there's bad news, like, I talk about not blindsiding your own boss. Of course, they might be upset. They might react. It's okay, but stop resisting. You probably read the chapter on resistance. Stop resisting their resistance. If they get angry, that's okay. But your job is to report the truth of what happened and what you think you're going to do to fix it. So when we avoid someone because we know what they're going to say or we're afraid of their reaction, there's like 3 layers of resistance going on there. And it's not just about what they're going to do. It's your reaction to what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm. I believe this, one of the greatest barriers to leadership is inactivity. It's that, I don't want to press into it. I want to avoid this, which you identify so well as being, a big part of avoiding the conflict. And it's like, no, you got to engage in it. You got to put in the work, and that can help move it forward. And, I think there's one thing that I really captured, and I appreciate this, and maybe just a note to end on is conflict isn't the problem.
No.
It's how we respond to it. It's how we frame it, how we believe that conflict, what it means and or what it could result in. That's the real problem.
Yep. Conflict is not the problem. Mismanagement is. And we avoid it. That's a mismanagement. And you've probably seen this too, moving people from one department to the next because, well, they're a troublemaker. So you know what? Or they're going to retire in 4 years. Let's just hang out. We're not going to try to course correct now because we've been giving them great evaluations for the last 25 years. So we really can't do anything. That's government entities, right? Can't do anything about it now because they have tenure and you can't fire them. And so, the avoidance of mismanagement.
Yeah, it's created a culture of, management leadership through avoidance. We can't say anything, as opposed to, man, that's not serving anyone. So, Marlene, I thank you so much for the conversation. What a tremendous message in this book, From Conflict to Courage. I appreciate you joining me today and sharing so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. One of the tools that Marlene mentioned that I think is probably most powerful is not only curiosity, asking questions, but it's asking this question. I'm going to read it here. What is happening that should not be happening? If we think about that in the context of our life, leadership, whatever it is, and if we are just sit back and ask the question, what is happening that should not be happening? Man, there's a whole host of next steps that come from that. We start to define actually what's happening, and then we start to clarify what we wish to happen. Because if it's happening and there's something not happening, it clears up what you do want. And I think that always leads a leader back to their vision. It leads a leader back to their values and mission. We discussed that. And I think it's imperative in this process of managing through conflict is, how do you assess that from a values point of view? Are you being outwardly aggressive, defiant, as, Marlene said at times? Are you choosing to roll your eyes and be, kind of passive aggressive? Or are you willing to be curious? You're willing to say, wait, I sense here that you're not following along. I sense here that maybe you're upset. Can you help me understand? Can you clear it up a little more? Can you, explain to me what's happening that's not happening? Well, what did you expect to happen in this situation so I can be aware? Because we're not on the same page. I think that curiosity and that willingness to dig in when there's conflict. Now, sometimes you may have to take a step away. Calmer heads will prevail. But I do believe this. The leaders, that are able to manage through conflict the best are the leaders that are able to affect change and create impact the most. It takes a maturity, it takes a healthiness. It still takes me being healthy in certain situations. It's a constant work. But I believe that is the option. And I believe that's what really comes out of having courage. I hope you got value from today's episode. Thanks for listening in. Go check out Marlene's book, From Conflict to Courage. I know you're going to get tremendous value. It's How to Stop Avoiding and Start Leading. And I think that's one of the great keys in leadership. Leadership isn't done by avoidance. It's done by action. Sometimes the best action is just asking questions. Thanks for being here. Would love for you to rate, review, wherever you listen to podcasts. Share it with others. Share it with people in your network. If you got value out of this, I'd love for you to send me a message. I love reading those, and I'm excited for others to join into the Impact Driven Leader Book Club. Again, we will be launching a new cohort group in July. If that's of interest of you, if you want to learn more about it, I'd love for you to send me an email at tyler@tylerdickerhoff.com. Would love to have a conversation with you and let you know about the group, the roundtable, and bring more to your life. Thanks for being here. Have a good one. We'll catch you next time.